Hi guys, we're back again. Mary and myself are gonna go through the next part of the Make Someone Welcome podcast. So this week we're gonna be looking at people's first experiences of disability, amongst other things. So stay tuned.
So as always, our episodes are following a theme, and as Matt said, today we're going to be looking at the power of attitudes and how our attitudes make a really big impact when it comes to inclusive communities. So in the last episodes, Matt, me and you have chatted about some of our experiences, positive and negative. And actually the thing that's linked all of them is that the biggest thing that's made a difference to being welcomed into a space is the attitudes of the people that we've come to meet.
Yeah, exactly. I think that is really important, and the more for me, we're in a world where we live in the 21st century now. And I think for me, people are more aware of disability, but there is still a bit of a way to go. But but saying that, the good thing is communities are becoming more inclusive.
Yeah.
And that's really powerful. I mean, you mentioned it last week when you do your climbing. People are aware now, you know what I mean? And I can remember the battles you had to start with. So we are getting there, and people are more aware. Supermarkets are more aware. And places where people go for leisure are more aware. Gig venues are more aware. So we are getting there. But for me, there is still a bit of a way to go.
Yeah, and that is where those attitudes that we have really comes into play to fill that gap that's currently there.
Exactly.
And I think it's quite interesting when we start to think about our own attitudes towards disability to have a bit of reflection about how your experience of disability has changed. So if you can, try and think back to your first kind of memory of disability, your first experience. And whilst you're thinking, I just want to share one of mine, Matt, which I know you know this, but I think it's still really important to revisit. And that is the fact that when I was aware of disability growing up, even though I wasn't disabled myself, I had disabled family members, disabled friends. But I would say my experience was quite sheltered still and quite narrow to kind of just a few individuals. And when I first met you, actually, I remember I just started working at a disability charity, so I did have quite a good understanding.
Yeah.
But I remember the first time I met you, when you came into the room, I just had this moment of this panic, because you're the first person I'd ever met who used a power chair or whose disability kind of affected their speech in some way. And when you first came into the room, I had this frozen panic, and I just was like, I don't know how to talk to this guy. That was my gut reaction.
Yeah.
And then within 30 seconds, I realised I just talked to you like I talked to anybody else.
Yeah.
And, we became really great mates not long after that.
Yeah.
But I think it's just really important to kind of, reflect that I did have that feeling and acknowledge that, but also look at how I've learned. And, I've never had that feeling again.
No.
When I've met someone who uses a power chair or with CP or whatever.
No. I mean, for me, it's slightly different. In our world, I say our world, in the disability community, I don't like this at all. And I touch on this in my book. But there is a hierarchy of disability, which some people may disagree, but when I was younger, I went to what they call a special school.
Yeah.
And although the school at the time was for people with physical disabilities. I didn't like getting labelled with the label of learning disabilities because back then they didn't have a nice label, and it was, see, if you had a physical disability, you tended to look down
Yeah.
on people with learning disabilities.
Yeah.
And I am totally horrified to look back
Yeah.
and think I thought that way, because ironically one of my first paid jobs, my very first paid job, was with a learning disability organisation, and it made me realise that we no matter what your disability is, we face the same prejudice and the same discrimination. So we are focusing on people's first encounter with disability, but I just wanted to give you that story because, like I said, even in the disability world, there is a hierarchy that we need to break even to this day.
Yeah, and I think the point that really shows is that actually, you know, the thoughts that we may have had, whatever your first experience was, and, you know, looking at some of our early experiences, you know, is that actually there might be stuff that you don't like, and, you know, you said you're horrified to think that that's how you used to think. But actually, you've got to confront that and actually challenge that, and that's like the first step.
Exactly.
Is to be like, have I actually got this right in the past? And if I haven't, what can I do going forward?
Yeah, and like as me and Mary both said, we've both reflected on on things we thought in the past. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think another like really important thing when we're thinking about our attitudes is not only just reflecting but be willing to learn in the future. Like there's stuff that we do now, stuff that we say now that actually in the future might not be as acceptable. You know, language, for example, is something that is constantly changing.
Yeah.
The words that, and I think we talked about it in a previous episode, but the words that we use evolves over time, and it's really important to, rather than be like, well, I've always used that word and it's fine, is to just be really open and willing to learn.
Yeah.
Because actually, if a community is telling you, you know, we don't want to be identified by that anymore, then it is totally our place to listen.
And also with words and language, different people have different trigger points.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean when it comes to words? It's like the word crip or cripple is a lot of people's trigger word, but actually the disability world is trying to re-own that word. So and also I would say with language, it's okay if you get it wrong. There's no don't be scared to ask or challenge or just talk to people.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Because that's how we learn.
Yeah, and even if you're disabled yourself, like, you've still got as much to learn.
Yeah.
Because, you know, our experience is only our experience.
Yeah.
And you all have differing opinions. You know, I mean, me and you sometimes chat about words and we're like, we think differently. And like, you exampled the word cripple. Like, in my house I had a corner with all my, like, mobility aids and stuff stored. And I had a little sign above it called Crip Corner, which I thought was, like, funny.
I love that.
Yeah, but I know another disabled person came in my house, they saw it and they were horrified. They were like, what an awful sign. And I was like, oh, it's just like tongue in cheek, bit of a joke. And they hated it, but that's because that was their experience and opinion of that word. So it's about respecting each other's voices.
Exactly, and following on from that, Mary, I hate the word retard.
Yeah.
Retard really does get under my skin for
Yeah.
some reason.
Mm.
But I know other people use it all the time. And different parts of the world, I know we're focusing on the UK here, but different parts of the world still use the word handicap
Yeah.
and retard. And so it just shows that some words to people can be really triggering and others can't. And I think your story about your sign shows that words can affect people, or language can affect people in different ways.
Yeah. And I think, like, as we're talking about these kind of disability-specific words, that is important, but I think often people get a bit hung up on making sure they say the right word, when actually, I think something that's probably even more important, rather than the precise words we're using, is just how we're talking about disability in general.
Exactly.
It's the tone. And often, disability is talked about in, sometimes quite like a pitiful tone, sometimes like overly inspirational, people saying you're inspiring for doing something mundane. Like, you've got an example, haven't you?
I have got an example. I was giving a talk to an individual, or was just speaking to an individual, and I said I'm married, live independently, and this person said, "Good on you for being married, good on you for living independently, good on you for having a job." And my two colleagues were with me at the time, and this is how used to things I got, because they said to me afterwards, "That was really patronising," and I was like, "Do you know what? Because I've been conditioned to just, I'm used to it to a certain extent, and I'm not saying that's right, but I just let it go over my head." But when I look back to what my colleagues had said, they were right, because no one says that to a non-disabled person. And actually, looking back, that's happened to me on several occasions.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Like, I've been congratulated by some stranger for getting my wheelchair out of a car once. And I'm like, that's so bizarre. Like, it's just that inappropriate use of praise around disability. You're like, why are people being weird like that?
Yeah, because no one would say that to a non-disabled person. But it just goes to show that as disabled people, we're even though we've probably got used to certain things, it's like now I'm really aware of people's words and the way they see their perception towards disability.
Yeah.
Another perception we have is disabled people don't get married or don't have relationships.
Yeah.
And I was in the hospital one time, the consultant came in, I was with my wife, and he automatically presumed my wife was my mum.
Yeah.
Now, that's shocking on several levels.
Yeah.
Well, my wife wasn't too impressed. Nothing against my mum, but my wife's my wife. And the surgeon was absolutely mortified. But that just goes to show about people's perception of disability in relationships. And if we had time, we would probably talk about that in more detail. But that's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah. And I think as well, when we're looking at kind of disability equality as a whole, it's actually something that all of us can do, no matter whether you're disabled or not, is to just make this stuff matter to you.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, a world or society that is more inclusive for disabled people is more inclusive for everybody. You know, for example, if you think about, you know, something that always gets me is when buildings have like an accessible entrance and a non-accessible entrance. And it's just looking at those two, and I'm always like, why don't we just make the accessible entrance the main entrance?
Yeah.
You know, unless there's a really good reason to, why do we have to segregate the accessible and the non-accessible? When actually so often, not that many people will get a kick for going up a few steps. Why don't we all just go up a little ramp together? Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. I mean, I'm going to quote Martin Luther King here. I do have a dream that one day that Mary's already touched on it, that access should be straight across the board so that everyone can get in everywhere. Do you know what I mean? And everyone can use transport. And that's not necessarily wiping out disability. That's not wiping out disability at all. But that's making society totally equal.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And we're not naive in this. Like, this is not an easy thing to do. And, you know, I think a conflict that often is ignored but is really challenging is that when you have impairments that have opposite access needs.
Yeah.
And, you know, that does happen quite often. You know, I think of my local library. At the bottom of the ramp, they have a big section of tactile paving, which is obviously really important for some people with visual impairments who rely on tactile paving, but is an absolute nightmare in my wheelchair because I have to kind of do a wheelie to get over it, and if I've got my kid on my lap, it's a whole hoo-ha.
Yeah.
But, you know, there are conflicting accessibility arrangements, and so it's not going to be possible to create something that works for every single person, but we can do a sure lot better than we currently do.
I mean, what I would say on from that, Mary, I've been to places and spaces before that say they're accessible, but for me, in a power chair, they're not. Do you know what I mean? So, you're right, we've all got different access needs. And I think one box doesn't fit all.
Yeah.
So I think that is the dilemma.
And I think in kind of the example you just said, one of the best things that we can do is, rather than blanket say this is an accessible space, is to describe the space, say this is what this space looks like, this is how, in different ways, because then people can make their own judgment on whether that is accessible or not.
Yeah, exactly.
So the other thing we wanted to chat about around the power of attitudes is labels, and the labels we give to people, and when we should be actually challenging these labels and preconceptions. So we've just got a little video that we're going to insert, or a little soundbite that we're going to insert here first.
I'm a client.
Customer.
Special.
I'm a patient.
I'm frail.
I'm a vulnerable adult.
I'm not eligible. A referral.
I'm a frequent flyer.
Bed blocker.
Vulnerable.
Danger.
A service user.
Statistic. Non-compliant.
Caseload.
Adult at risk.
I need looking after.
Yes, sod that. Actually, I'm a human.
This is Abby.
I'm Matt.
I'm Sam.
I'm Freya.
I'm Danny.
I'm Mary.
I am Abby.
I have bipolar. I volunteer. I love community. I love people.
I'm creative, messy, Netflix binge watcher, funny.
I'm a granddad. I'm a husband.
I'm chaotic, I'm messy, I'm stubborn, I'm loud.
I'm strong, independent, don't shut up, and I love gaming.
I am a mum, a wife, I'm loud, I'm outgoing, and I'm opinionated.
I go to gigs. I live my life. I'm independent. I play power chair football. There's more to me than just being disabled.
Okay, so the kind of point that video, that soundbite was trying to get at is that all of us are given labels in our lives, right? And now why do we use labels? Like, why do people get given labels? You know, I think one of them is like convenience.
Yeah.
You know, when you're in a professional setting, to be like, oh, this is a, you know, a patient, a client, service user. It is that kind of convenience. Or maybe to like categorize people. So you can look at a group of people and you can slap a label on them and it will very quickly, briefly describe a characteristic of that group. And, you know, sometimes around safety, safeguarding, people may feel that there is a need for those labels. But actually, labels have such a power, don't they?
Yeah, they do. I mean, labels are really just for jump jars and they have such negative connotations as well. In the pandemic, a majority of disabled people were labelled vulnerable. That had a massive impact on me and what I thought the wording that people use.
Yeah.
For example, vulnerable is a label that was used far too much in the pandemic, and actually it had a negative impact. Yes, I get there needs to be the word labels in a way, and this may sound contradictory. You're always going to have labels, but in my eyes, they need to be scrapped.
Yeah.
Because we're all, at the end of the day, we're all just individuals.
Yeah. And they're incredibly like reductionist, and I think your example of in the pandemic, you know, alongside vulnerable was the phrase like pre-existing conditions.
Yeah.
And the impact that had in the pandemic was that it reduced the value of a human's life. Because how many times did you hear someone say, you know, so-and-so has died, but they had a pre-existing condition. It was as if that didn't matter as much because they were disabled. And that's horrible to think about, but that is exactly what happened.
Yes, and that was horrifying. And yeah, when you label someone, you make them a scapegoat as well. Whereby sometimes I felt because I had the label vulnerable, that I was weak, I was person that needed help.
Yeah, like helpless person.
So labels are, for me, just for jam jars and boxes. And
I think the thing about them is that they give people identity.
Yeah.
And I do sometimes see, personally, I think there can be some value if it's a positive label that someone has attached to themselves.
Yeah.
So because it can help someone kind of shape that part of their identity. So, you know, so for me, I would say, and even for you know, like I'm married, that is a characteristic that I have, that is, you know, I'm a mum, that's a label that I love, you know, I'm a climber, that's a label that I love. And so I think there are really positive things, but it's what we're talking about is all those examples where labels are given to people, like patient, like client, like service user, bed blocker, vulnerable. When people are given these labels, and the problem with them is it has the same effect as those positive ones. It can become part of your identity.
Mary, that's a really good point that you made, and it's made me just think that I don't always necessarily, I've never seen label in a positive.
Mm.
Do you know what I mean? So that just goes to show how we look at things differently.
Mm.
Do you know what I mean? Labels for me have always had a negative connotation,
Yeah.
whereas, yeah, it's like I'm a husband. I'm married, and but that to me that's not a label. So that just what I'm saying is it just goes to show how differently two people can see things.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, when we're talking about the attitudes that we have and how that makes an impact on inclusive communities, I think me and you could literally talk about this all day
Yeah.
long. But, you know, you'll be pleased to hear we're not going to talk about it all day long, and we're going to kind of wrap it up here. But there really is so much more that goes into this. But I think the takeaway is to just remember the importance that your attitudes have on a space. Even if you came to a space and it was physically the least accessible place in the world, the simple act of your attitudes can make a huge difference. And I hope that's encouraging,
Yeah.
because actually that is something we all have power over, we all have control over.
And again, at the end of the day, we just want you to make you think positively, and ultimately it's about getting you guys to become allies
Yeah.
in the disability movement, because the next generation of people with disabilities or disabled people are going to see things differently. So it's really important for you guys to become allies.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you catch us in our last episode of the podcast, which will be looking at the power of learning.
Cheers, guys. Hope you enjoyed it.